Stop. Do not skip this. If this message found you, it's not because you were searching. It's because something in your life reached a breaking point and silence was no longer allowed. This is not comfort. This is not coincidence. And this is not for everyone. You didn't arrive here randomly. You arrived here because delay expired, tolerance ran out, and intervention began. You've been feeling it. The pressure, the restlessness, the sense that something must change, even if you don't know what yet. That feeling is not anxiety, it's soul's alignment knocking. And if you ignore this moment, it will not repeat itself the same way. Listen carefully. This message did not find you by accident. And no, that is not meant to comfort you. It is meant to confront you, because comfort keeps people asleep. And this message exists because something in your life could no longer afford your sleep. If this message found you, it means a limit was reached, a quiet one. Not dramatic, not explosive, but final. It means delay expired. It means confusion ran out of permission. It means a season that once protected you began to restrain you, and intervention became necessary. Intervention does not mean punishment. It means correction before damage becomes permanent. You are here because silence stopped working. For a long time, nothing external changed, yet something internal kept tightening. You kept moving, you kept functioning, you kept showing up. But inside, the weight increased. The patience thinned, the tolerance faded. You could no longer lie to yourself the way you used to. That wasn't set weakness. That was awareness waking up. You've been asking quietly, not through loud prayers or dramatic declarations, but through exhaustion, through the way effort stopped feeling rewarding, through the way things that once mattered lost their grip, through the way rest no longer restored you. You didn't say it out loud, but you felt it. Something isn't set right anymore, and that sentence matters, because most people ignore that signal. They numb it, distract from it, replace it with noise. But you didn't. You stayed present long enough to feel it, fully, and feeling it fully is what brought you here. Let this be corrected clearly. You were never invisible. You were never overlooked. You were never forgotten. Nothing you endured was ignored. Nothing you carried was wasted. Nothing about your struggle was accidental. What you interpreted as silence was actually restraint. Timing being held back until you are able to carry what comes next without breaking under it. You assume that if something mattered, it would have happened faster. That belief is false. Some things happen slowly because speed would have ruined you. Some doors stay closed because if they opened too early, you would have walked into them unprepared and misused what was inside. Delay is not denial. Delay is often protection disguised as frustration. You were not being punished. You were being prepared. Prepared to think differently. Prepared to stop relying on external validation. Prepared to stand without constant reassurance. Prepared to move without needing approval. Because what you are being shaped for does not allow emotional dependency. It does not allow confusion. It does not allow the old version of you that needed constant confirmation to keep going. That version had to weaken, so the real one could emerge. This is the part people misunderstand. They think growth feels like clarity. It doesn't. It feels like disorientation first. It feels like being between identities. Not who you were, but not fully who you're becoming yet. That in-between space is uncomfortable. But it is necessary. You are here because that space reached its limit. Something higher decided you've learned enough in silence, that the lessons embedded in waiting, endurance and restraint have already been absorbed. And now, continuing without clarity would do more harm than interruption ever could. So this message arrives as a line in the sand, not to scare you, but to wake you up. Because remaining passive right now would cost you momentum. Remaining undecided would cost you direction. Remaining attached to what you've outgrown would cost you the next version of yourself. This is why the message feels personal. This is why it feels heavy. This is why it doesn't sound like generic motivation. It's not speaking to your surface thoughts. It's addressing the deeper knowing you've been trying to manage quietly. You were prepared through resistance. You were strengthened through delay. You were refined through being unseen. And now, you stare being confronted with a simple truth. Staying the same is no longer neutral. Its pet's no longer safe. And its sits no longer aligned. That is why this message found you, not to praise you, not to soothe you, but to position you. What comes next depends on whether you recognize this moment for what it is, or treat it like just another video, because it isn't set. And you already know that. Intervention does not begin when everything collapses. That is the lie people believe because it keeps them passive. Real intervention begins much earlier, when things still look normal on the outside, but something inside you refuses to stay quiet. You are still functioning, still showing up, still doing what was expected of you. From the outside, nothing looked broken enough to justify change. And that is exactly why this moment matters. Because the most dangerous place to stay is a life that works just enough to keep you stuck. You didn't break down suddenly. You wore down slowly. Motivation didn't disappear overnight. It drained quietly. Things that once energized you started feeling heavy. Conversations felt repetitive. Goals felt distant. Even rest stopped working the way it used to. That wasn't burnout. That was misalignment. And misalignment always announces itself before it destroys anything. It shows up as discomfort before disaster, restlessness before collapse, inner resistance before outer consequences. That inner resistance is not rebellion, and said as intelligence. God does not interrupt people who are aligned. He interrupts patterns that are no longer aligned with where they are meant to go. He intervenes when staying the same would cost you more than the discomfort of changing. And be honest with yourself right now. You already felt the shift before this message ever appeared. You felt the discomfort growing without explanation. You felt the restlessness that no distraction could fix. You felt doors closing that you didn't expect to close. You felt connections weaken that you thought were permanent. You felt your tolerance for certain things quietly disappear. That wasn't loss. That was extraction. You were being removed from something you had already outgrown, even though your logic hadn't caught up yet. Your mind was still trying to justify staying. Your habits were still tied to familiarity, but your awareness had already moved ahead. This is where many people get stuck. They mistake extraction for failure. They assume something went wrong because something ended. They personalize transitions that were never about worth. But growth doesn't ask for your permission. It asks for your honesty. And honesty would require you to admit this. You stayed longer than you should have because it was familiar, not because it was right. Familiarity is powerful. It makes stagnation feel safe. It convinces you that discomfort means danger, when sometimes discomfort simply means expiration. You weren't losing direction. You were losing tolerance for misalignment. And that loss is necessary. Because if you could still tolerate what you've outgrown, you would never move. You would adapt downward. You would shrink to survive. You would betray your own awareness just to avoid uncertainty. So discomfort intensified. Confusion increased. Clarity seemed delayed, not because something was wrong, but because something was being dismantled internally before it could be rebuilt correctly. Intervention always begins with subtraction. First, certainty is removed. Then attachments loosen. Then old motivations stop working, not to weaken you, but to expose what you were leaning on that could no longer support where you're headed. You think the struggle was about circumstances. It wasn't. It was about identity. about shedding versions of yourself that could not cross into the next season intact. That is why everything familiar started feeling foreign. That is why what once fit now feels tight. That is why returning to old patterns feels heavier than moving forward into uncertainty. Your inner alignment shifted first. Your outer life just hasn't caught up yet. And that gap, that uncomfortable space between inner clarity and external reality, is where intervention speaks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. It shows up through restlessness you can't ignore, through dissatisfaction you can explain away, through a sense that staying where you are would require betraying something inside you. That something is not arrogance. It stands not impatience. It sits not ingratitude. It sits growth asking for permission to continue, and permission is no longer optional. This is the point where you stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what is no longer meant for me? Because the moment you ask the wrong question, you turn a transition into self-doubt. But when you ask the right one, clarity begins to surface. Intervention is not chaos. It accepts precision. It doesn't tear your life down randomly. It targets what no longer belongs. It interrupts patterns before they become prisons. It removes comfort before comfort turns into complacency. You were not being pushed away from something. You were being pulled forward. And this part matters deeply. You didn't imagine this shift. You didn't create it out of fear. You didn't manifest it accidentally. You recognized it because you were ready to. Which means what comes next will require participation, not observation. The extraction has already started. The alignment is already underway. And now, staying unaware would cost you more than paying attention ever could. Here is the hard truth. Most people never want to hear, even when they sense it stirs true. If you had been allowed to stay comfortable, you would have stayed smaller than you were meant to be. Comfort is not evil, but it is dangerous when it overstays its purpose. Comfort dulls urgency. It blurs discernment. It convinces you that survival is success and familiarity is safety. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to trade potential for predictability. That is what was happening. Not because you were weak, but because you are human. So comfort had to be disturbed. If nothing had challenged you, you would have settled into routines that required less courage, but offered less growth. You would have adjusted your expectations downward. You would have normalized what no longer fits simply because it didn't actively hurt yet. But stagnation rarely hurts loudly. It numbs quietly. That is why resistance appeared, not as chaos, not as punishment, but as pressure. Delays showed up where progress used to be easy. Friction entered spaces that once flowed. Effort began costing more energy than it used to. Not because you were failing, but because the path you were on had reached its limit. And limits are merciful. They stop you from wasting years trying to extract growth from places that can no longer produce it. This is where many people get confused. They assume resistance means they're on the wrong path entirely. Sometimes it does, but other times resistance means the path has served its purpose and it's time to transition. Growth is not always about pushing harder. Sometimes it's about letting go sooner. Every major transformation follows this pattern. Before clarity arrives, confusion intensifies. Before expansion, restriction tightens. Before authority develops, pressure exposes weakness. Storms before crossings. Silence before calling. Weight before strength. This isn't poetic language. It's structural reality. Think of a seed. Before it ever rises, it is buried, covered, pressured, hidden. If you judged that seed by its surface conditions, you would assume it was failing. But the pressure is not the enemy. The pressure is the instruction, and you have been under pressure longer than you expected. Not because something went wrong, but because what is being formed in you requires depth, not speed. You kept asking why it was taking so long, why clarity felt delayed, why momentum stalled. But the question was never about time. Time alone cannot build discernment. Time alone cannot create restraint. Time alone cannot teach you how to stand when external reinforcement disappears. Those things require resistance. So resistance was introduced strategically, not to break you, but to reveal where you were still dependent on comfort, validation, or certainty. To show you what would collapse under pressure so it could be rebuilt stronger. This is uncomfortable to hear, but necessary. Some parts of you had to be weakened so others could grow. The version of you that needed reassurance could not go forward. The version of you that needed constant clarity could not advance. The version of you that relied on external stability would not survive the next phase. So those supports began to fail, not suddenly, gradually, enough to get your attention, but not enough to destroy you. That balance is intentional. You weren't meant to panic. You were meant to notice. Notice that what once motivated you no longer does. Notice that tolerance has dropped. Notice that returning to old habits feels heavier than moving forward into uncertainty. That heaviness is not fear, it stalls incompatibility. You are no longer built for what you're trying to stay in, and the longer you resist that truth, the more uncomfortable staying becomes. That discomfort is not cruelty. It's guidance. Because if growth felt easy at this stage, you wouldn't respect it. If transition felt gentle, you would delay it. If clarity arrived without cost, you wouldn't protect it. So difficulty increased, just enough to force honesty. And honesty would require you to admit this. You cannot become who you are meant to be without disrupting who you've been pretending to be comfortable as. That pretense is exhausting. And you'd have felt that exhaustion deeply. Not physical tiredness, existential tiredness. The kind that rest doesn't fix. The kind that sleep doesn't cure. The kind that signals a deeper mismatch between who you are and how you're living. That mismatch is why resistance exists, not as an obstacle, but as a signal. And now that signal is too clear to ignore. This phase is not about pushing harder against resistance. It's about understanding why resistance appeared in the first place. Because once you understand that, you stop fighting the process and start cooperating with it. And cooperation is what unlocks what comes next. You kept asking why it was taking so long, but the delay was never about time. It was about depth. Time can move things forward, but it cannot prepare you to carry weight. It cannot teach restraint. It cannot build discernment. Those qualities are not learned through speed. They are forged through pressure, repetition, and silence. What was happening beneath the surface mattered more than what you could see externally. While you were waiting for circumstances to change, something far more important was being reshaped internally. Your tolerance for chaos was shrinking. Your appetite for shallow wins was fading. Your ability to sit with uncertainty without panicking was increasing, even if it didn't feel like progress at the time. This is the part most people misinterpret. They assume preparation feels empowering. It doesn't. Real preparation feels disorienting. It strips away the emotional rewards you used to rely on. It removes the reassurance you once needed to keep moving. It forces you to continue without feedback, without validation, and without immediate results. And that is not accidental. Because where you are being positioned, applause would have distracted you. Approval would have softened your edge. Constant reassurance would have made you dependent instead of decisive. So those things were removed, slowly and intentionally, until you learned how to move without them. Your patience was not being tested randomly, it was being strengthened. Your discernment was not delayed, it was being sharpened. You were learning to feel when something was wrong before it fully collapsed. You were learning to sense misalignment before it turned into damage. You were being trained to listen to subtle internal signals instead of waiting for external confirmation. That training required silence. And silence is uncomfortable because it offers no distractions. It removes excuses. It leaves you alone with your thoughts, your doubts, and your habits. But silence is not absence. It is calibration. It forces you to confront what you have been avoiding and refine what you have been carrying unnecessarily. You may not have realized it, but during this period, you stopped reacting impulsively. You stopped chasing every opportunity. You stopped explaining yourself excessively. You became more selective with your energy, your words, and your commitments. That wasn't withdrawal. That was maturation. The waiting stretched longer than you wanted because the old version of you needed time to loosen its grip. Certain expectations had to dissolve. Certain attachments had to weaken. Certain identities had to lose relevance. You could not step forward fully while still being emotionally anchored to what no longer fit. And that process cannot be rushed. If it had happened faster, you would have carried unfinished attachments into the next phase. You would have recreated old patterns in a new environment. You would have repeated cycles instead of breaking them. So the delay stayed. The pressure remained. The clarity arrived slowly instead of all at once, not to frustrate you but to protect what was forming. Because sudden clarity without internal stability creates arrogance. Slow clarity builds wisdom. You were learning how to hold your ground without needing constant reassurance. You were learning how to trust your internal compass, even when external signals were quiet. You were learning how to move with intention instead of impulse. These are not small lessons, they are foundational. This is why silence felt heavy instead of peaceful, because it wasn't meant to soothe you. It was meant to shape you. It was meant to remove noise so precision could develop. And precision is required where you are going. If you look back honestly, you will see that this period changed how you think, how you respond, and how you tolerate uncertainty. You no longer rush the way you used to. You no longer cling the way you once did. You no longer accept things simply because they are familiar. That shift did not happen overnight. It happened through sustained pressure and quiet recalibration. This is the part of growth that rarely gets acknowledged. The invisible restructuring, the internal realignment that makes the next step possible without collapse. You were not stalled. You were stabilizing. And now that stabilization is complete, remaining in silence would no longer serve you. Remaining in preparation would turn into avoidance. Remaining in waiting would become disobedience to your own growth. That is why this moment exists, because preparation has reached its threshold. The internal foundation is strong enough now to support movement without disintegration. You are no longer the same person who entered this season, even if your external life hasn't caught up yet. And that difference matters, because it means what comes next will not overwhelm you the way it once would have. It means you can move with clarity instead of confusion, with restraint instead of reaction, with authority instead of doubt. Silence has done its work. Calibration is complete. And now, transition is no longer premature. It is necessary. This moment is not about comfort, reassurance, or emotional relief. It is about clarity. And clarity often arrives without warmth. Clarity demands honesty before it offers peace. You are being asked to see something as it truly is, not as you hoped it would become, not as it once was, and not as you tried to preserve it out of habit. There is something you have been holding on to that has already completed its purpose. It may be a mindset, a version of yourself, a direction, a relationship, or an identity that once made sense but no longer aligns with who you are becoming. The reason it feels difficult to release is because it once protected you. It served you in an earlier season. It gave you stability when you needed it. But protection is not the same as purpose. and what once kept you safe can quietly prevent you from growing. This is where most people stall. They confuse loyalty with alignment. They mistake endurance for wisdom. They remain committed to what is familiar even when it drains them, because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. But safety that limits growth eventually turns into confinement, and confinement always demands a decision. The discomfort you are experiencing is not random. It is the signal that your current environment can no longer sustain your internal evolution. You are being asked to release what no longer fits, not because it is bad, but because it is complete. Completion does not require blame. It requires recognition. You may be tempted to wait for reassurance before letting go, to wait for clarity that removes all risk, to wait until the transition feels gentle. But intervention does not wait for comfort. It arrives when the cost of staying exceeds the fear of leaving. And right now, staying would require you to silence parts of yourself that have already awakened. That silencing would come at a cost. It would dull your intuition. It would erode your confidence. It would slowly teach you to distrust your own signals. And once that trust is lost, regaining it takes far longer than releasing what needs to go right now. You are standing at a threshold, whether you acknowledge it or not. On one side is what you know, what you can predict, what you have learned to navigate, even when it no longer fulfills you. On the other side is uncertainty, but also expansion. Growth rarely offers guarantees. It offers alignment instead. This is not about making a dramatic move or burning everything behind you. It is about internal release first. It is about loosening emotional attachments to outcomes, identities and expectations that no longer belong to you. External changes will follow internal decisions, not the other way around. You may feel exposed in this moment. That exposure is not weakness. It is honesty without distraction. When old defenses fall away, clarity sharpens. When familiar structures loosen, awareness expands. This is uncomfortable because it removes excuses, but it also restores agency. You are not being forced into something you cannot handle. You are being invited into something that requires you to trust the preparation you have already completed. The hesitation you feel is not a sign to stop. It is the friction between who you were trained to be and who you are now capable of becoming. If you wait for certainty, you will wait indefinitely. Certainty follows commitment, not the other way around. Movement creates clarity, not hesitation. This is why partial attention, partial effort, and partial surrender are no longer sustainable. They keep you suspended between worlds, unable to fully leave and unable to fully arrive. The cost of hesitation is subtle but real. It drains momentum. It prolongs discomfort. It turns awareness into anxiety instead of action. You have already felt that cost, and you do not need to keep paying it. This moment is asking for a decision, not an explanation. You do not need to justify your growth to anyone. You do not need permission to release what no longer aligns. You do not need approval to move forward with integrity. Clarity is here. The question is whether you will honor it or negotiate with it. Because once clarity arrives and is ignored, it does not disappear quietly, it intensifies. It returns as frustration, as restlessness, as dissatisfaction that cannot be reasoned away. You are being given the chance to respond before that happens. This is not pressure meant to overwhelm you. It is precision meant to focus you. You are not being rushed. You are being aligned. And alignment always begins with release. Behind you is what you know, what you have learned to navigate, what you can manage even when it no longer fulfills you. Ahead of you is what you were prepared for, even if you cannot yet see it clearly. Remaining where you are may feel easier in the moment, but ease is no longer neutral. Staying now requires effort, suppression, and compromise. It requires you to silence instincts that have already matured. You are not standing still. You are standing between versions of yourself. And this space is uncomfortable because it does not allow denial. You can no longer convince yourself that staying is harmless. You can no longer pretend that postponing a decision is wisdom. What once felt like patience is now resistance, and resistance carries its own weight. Let this be corrected clearly, and without hesitation. You are not behind. You are not late. You are not broken. You are early. You arrived at this awareness sooner than most people ever do, and that early arrival demanded a different kind of preparation. You were trained quietly because public training would have distracted you. You were strengthened internally because external reinforcement would not always be available where you are going. You learned how to move without applause. You learned how to continue without reassurance. You learned how to stand when the structure around you was uncertain. These were not accidental lessons. They were intentional reinforcements for a season that requires self-trust and clarity more than emotional validation. Intervention is often misunderstood as rescue. It is not. Rescue implies weakness. Intervention implies readiness. You were not being pulled out because you could not handle where you were. You were being released because you no longer needed it to survive. Survival was never the goal. Capacity was. Old cycles began losing their hold because you outgrew them. Old thinking patterns weakened because they could not sustain your expanding awareness. Old limits dissolved because they were based on a version of you that no longer exists. This is not loss. This is liberation through maturity. You may feel alone in this transition, that isolation is not abandonment. It is clarity without noise. It removes external influence long enough for you to hear your own discernment clearly. When distractions fall away, direction becomes sharper, even if it initially feels heavier. The strength you now carry was not built through ease. It was built through restraint, through delayed gratification, through learning to sit with discomfort without escaping it. That strength is not loud, but it is stable, and stability is what allows movement without collapse. This is the point where doubt must be confronted honestly. Doubt is not asking whether you are capable. It is asking whether you trust the work that has already been done within you. Because capability has already been established, you would not be here otherwise. You are not stepping into uncertainty unprepared. You are stepping into it trained. The difference matters. One leads to panic. The other leads to authority. Authority does not come from dominance or control. It comes from alignment. When your internal direction and external actions move together, resistance fades. Effort becomes efficient. Decisions feel cleaner. You no longer exhaust yourself questioning every step because you trust the process that shaped you. Remaining where you are would require shrinking your awareness, dulling your discernment, and pretending the preparation never happened. Moving forward requires courage, but it also honors everything you have already endured. One choice erases growth. The other completes it. This transition is not about becoming someone else. It is about finally allowing yourself to act as who you already are. The hesitation you feel is not a lack of readiness. It is the final tension before momentum. You have crossed the internal threshold already. The external shift is simply catching up. And now, movement is not reckless. It is responsible, because staying would mean denying your own evolution, and you have already come too far to do that. What remains is not uncertainty. It is alignment waiting to be activated. You may not have the full picture yet, and that is not a failure. You were never meant to see everything before moving. You were meant to feel enough clarity to act without hesitation. Full understanding comes after alignment, not before it. Waiting to see the entire path is another form of delay. And delay is no longer what this moment allows. What you do have now is awareness. You have recognition. You have an internal signal that is steady instead of chaotic, firm instead of emotional. That signal is not fear. It is readiness. Fear scatters your thoughts. Readiness focuses them, and right now your focus is narrowing toward what matters instead of what is comfortable. This is the point where everything becomes simple, even if it does not become easy. The noise falls away. The options reduce. The justifications stop working. You can feel the difference between what drains you and what strengthens you without needing to analyze it endlessly. That is not coincidence. That is discernment fully online. So here is the activation, and it is direct. Stop questioning the timing. The timing has already been confirmed by the fact that you are here and still present. Stop romanticizing what you have outgrown. Nostalgia is not truth, and memory is not alignment. Stop waiting for permission to step into what you already recognize as necessary. Permission was never required for growth. Only honesty was. Alignment is not something that arrives later. Alignment is something you choose now. It is the decision to move in the same direction internally and externally, even when the external results are not immediate. It is the decision to honor clarity instead of negotiating with it. Pay attention to what feels heavy, because it is being removed. Pay attention to what feels clear, because it is being confirmed. Pay attention to what you can no longer tolerate, because tolerance has expired. These are not problems to fix. They are signals to follow. Nothing you endured was wasted. Every delay strengthened something you now rely on. Every silent season refined your judgment. Every moment of being unseen removed dependency and built internal authority. You were prepared, not stalled. You were trained, not ignored. And now the preparation phase is complete. This does not mean everything will suddenly become easy. It means resistance will now come from the outside instead of the inside. When internal alignment is established, obstacles no longer confuse you. They clarify direction. You move through them with intention instead of doubt. What happens next depends entirely on whether you treat this moment as confirmation or entertainment. Passive listening will change nothing. Conscious participation will change everything. Engagement is not about visibility. It is about decision. It is about marking the moment you stopped ignoring what you already knew. If this message resonated, do not minimize it. Do not scroll past it as if it was nothing. Acknowledge it, not for validation, but for alignment. Let action follow awareness, even in small ways, because momentum begins with movement. You are not being asked to become something new. You are being asked to stop delaying what has already formed. You are not stepping into the unknown empty-handed. You are stepping into it equipped. This message did not find you to motivate you. It found you to position you. Intervention is not approaching. It is already underway. What you choose next determines whether alignment completes or stalls, and you already know which choice is yours. This is where the message ends, but where responsibility begins. Not because you were pressured, not because you were convinced, but because you recognized truth when it stood in front of you. You were not brought here to feel inspired and then return to the same patterns. You were brought here to become aware of what is no longer negotiable. Awareness without action fades. Awareness with action becomes alignment. So do not rush, but do not retreat. Do not explain, but do not ignore. Do not dramatize, but do not delay. Carry this message with you, not as emotion but as clarity. Let it influence the next decision you make, the next boundary you honor, the next direction you choose not to abandon. Nothing more needs to be said. What matters now is what you do after the sound fades. Because this message, did not find you on purpose just to pass through you. It found you because you were ready to carry it forward.